Well, welcome back, everybody, and let me add my thanks to Corinne and the previous panelists who did a fantastic job talking about social emotional learning and inclusive pedagogies. What we're going to do now is shift the focus somewhat and think more about the intersection between SEL and assessment. As Claire said in the opening this morning, this whole day has been about looking at the intersection between social emotional learning and social justice. And we wanted to look at that topic, particularly through two lenses, one being pedagogical approaches with an emphasis on inclusive pedagogies, and secondly, through assessment. I read this amazing definition of active listening back in May, I think it was, although it feels like it was several lifetimes ago. And it was talking about immersive theatre practice and how if you go into the conversation with the intention of being changed by what you hear, it can have a massive impact on what you take away from it. We have a fabulous lineup of panelists with very different takes on the topic of SEL and assessment. So I think for all of us who are watching this live, who are watching the recording on demand later this week or in the future, there is the great opportunity to be changed by what we're about to hear. The way this session is going to be structured is I will introduce each of the three panelists in a minute and ask each of them an opening question. And once they've had some time to answer their opening questions, we'll move into a conversation between the four of us fairly quickly. And we would love to bring in as many questions and comments as you, the audience, would like to pose. We should have time to get through most of the questions, I hope. We've got about 50 minutes for this. So we have this amazing lineup of panelists. We have Jennifer Groff, who is a research associate with Qatar Foundation, working on the WISE Innovation Hub based in Doha. We have Joanne McEachen, who's the founder and chief executive of the Learner First, and also with me, a member of the executive committee of Karanga. And we have Jakob Scheersen from the Center for Hybrid Intelligence for the University of Aarhus. So Jen, if we could start with you, if that's okay. So in your work as a researcher with WISE's Innovation Hub, you're very much working at the cutting edge of education innovation and reform. And I would love to hear a bit more about how assessment fits into the bigger reform agenda and how you think we can support good learning over the long term and not fall into bad practice where we end up measuring the right things, but in the wrong way. And then finally, and this is a rather long opening question, how you see social and emotional learning assessment helping with more equitable education outcomes.
Yes, thank you, Dominic, and really great to be here with everyone. So I am the Innovation Fellow at WISE, where I'm leading the development of their Innovation Hub, which is essentially a platform that is supporting a number of schools in driving their future changes of how they want to be as a learning environment. We actually started this work in January of this year, so right before it became relevant actually for all schools to be looking at this deep change. And so it's been very serendipitous. Much of the work that we do is looking at the deep pedagogical changes that need to happen, both based on learning sciences research, knowing how children learn and how many things we do in traditional learning environments don't always support that. But moreover, all of the deep changes that need to happen for learners to prepare them for the world that they're already immersed in, and especially the one they're going to inherit. So many broad competencies become the main focus then, and helping learners have agency and voice and control in developing those. And so in that work, I think one of the hardest challenges for any school today, but particularly those at this leading edge where they're trying to move in this direction, is to unpack what these competencies really are. So it's been wonderful to watch that broader global conversation about the need to shift to these broader skills and competencies, and particularly SEL being a main aspect of that, as it should be. But part of the challenge is that we sort of have a diverse diffusion of research around these competencies, and therefore then tools and infrastructure to support them. And so our work includes helping schools not only drive their pathway forward and where they want to take their learning environment, but particularly working with them to prototype, innovate, and iterate on innovations that support where we want to go, even though collectively the field of education hasn't gotten it all figured out yet. And so obviously a big piece of that is assessment. And I'll just conclude by saying that our hope is that you know, we've learned a lot about the negative impacts of the ways assessments can be used, both from a structural standpoint, literally what tests look like and how they're administered, but from a policy standpoint and the weights that come along with them. And I hope that we learn from that as we design our pathway into the future. And part of that work then means thinking about not only new ways of assessing learners with these new models or these new competencies, but also you fundamentally have to shift pedagogy. You have to shift how you support learning in the classroom. And now is the perfect time to be doing that. We really have no reason at this point to not be doing deep shifts in pedagogy. So thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jen. That's a great opening and lots for us to return to in the later part of this conversation. So Jacob, if we could turn to you now. A lot of your work is about taking ideas to scale. So from your perspective, how can we scale up social and emotional learning assessment through digital means without losing the human connection? And how can we manage that in a way that gives us more equitable education outcomes?
Thank you. So thanks a lot for the invitation to come here, and also for the big question to start off with. And of course, it would be fantastic if I just gave you the recipe for answering that question. I think the slightly disappointing answer to this is, of course, no one knows fully. But I can say what we are doing at the Center for Hyperintelligence to at least start taking steps in that direction. And I really think that what we're working with is sort of working with digital technologies to see whether we can scale up foundational research on understanding basic cognition and soft skills like creativity and collaboration and trust. And then we apply that to educational settings with two purposes in mind, to develop what we call sort of a hybrid mode, going from digital plus analog, of first of all, taking well-known assessment mechanisms that are at the moment sort of employed and very laborious because they have to be administered and manually checked, and we are working on, okay, can we find ways of automizing that using semantic-based algorithms? And the purpose of that is to sort of chip away some parts of the tasks that are really time-consuming, and then allow for more time for the parts that we really still needs that human touch. And the second approach to this is then also to use these digital approaches as a playground for investigating sort of some of the concepts that we don't fully understand yet. And what we are then sort of hoping is that when we start to assess, that assessment doesn't become sort of the end of a conversation, but that digital assessment can be a start of a new conversation that we can have about how we measure and what it is that we measure. Because I think that's really the foundational question. When we talk about trust and collaboration, creativity, it's very important that it's embedded into our assessment culture that this is something that we still don't understand fully, and that we're just giving tools to allow the individual teachers to have their own sort of build their own faith in their confidence of their assessments of the students. And I think that one of the things that we sort of believe very deeply is that when we work on these educational technologies, then the one core principle of that is that if we want to teach collaboration, then there is no tool or no AI technology that will just work for this. So what we need to be better at is to engaging with teachers, and we need to develop software models and not just software packages that can be sort of flexible to the needs of the individual classrooms. Every teacher should be able to go in and have a module and design their own module and digital interactions, physical digital interactions that are suited to their needs. And then the final thing that we think when you talked about equity is that I sort of very strongly believe that in these sort of very exploratory domains where we actually don't know what creativity is either in real life or in the classroom, then all of these digital experiments that we can start to construct will have a spillover effect to our real world classrooms, where we will learn how to facilitate collaboration, for instance, among students, and we also will learn better how to do that sort of on the analog scale. So what we're believing is that many of these things are actually happening very well and being assessed very well by individual teachers, but digital technologies can be the scaffolding to sort of ensure that we lift the bar, that we give every teacher the support that they need in order to do the best kind of education.
I love that. I think it's brilliant. One of our partners in the whole Education for Tomorrow's World series is Microsoft, and Mark Sparvel from Microsoft has said in Salzburg on a number of occasions that he sees their role at Microsoft as using technology to humanize the teaching experience. So exactly like you were saying, where we can use new technology to lighten teachers' assessment load so they can focus on assessing and supporting students for things that the AI or the algorithms can't do, is so important. The other thing I think which is brilliant about what you just said is it kind of chimes with what feels like a really interesting global current at the moment, where the role of teachers is being reappraised by people across society, because teachers' role has been so missed during the school shutdown, and we're seeing all the different roles that schools play in students' lives. And as more and more parents have become invested in their children's education because they're present for so much of it, the appreciation of teachers' skills is going up. So there's a lot in what you just said that we'll come back to as well, I think. Jojo, if we could turn to you now. I know that you've worked in many different countries around the world, and I've heard you say on many different occasions variations on the theme of real equity can only be achieved when learners can show what they know in their own way. So from your experience and the work that you're doing with the Learner First, how can this work across a whole system or indeed across different countries?
I think, thanks very much, Dominic, and tēnā koutou katoa, ko Joanne McEachen, ko Ngāi Tahu, ko Waitaha, ko Ngāri Pero, Ngāri Mamoi, te iwi, te whananatanga Aotearoa. What I'm just saying is that I'm speaking from New Zealand, and my tribes are Ngāti Mamoi, Waitaha, and Ngāi Tahu. And I always introduce myself speaking a little bit of Māori first, because that locates me culturally. And I think one of the things that we often forget to do is to recognize who we are, where we come from, and really locate ourselves culturally. Because in a lot of work we do, we don't recognize ourselves. And that's part of what I talk about in assessment, is just to really begin with who you are, where you come from, your language and your identity, rather than to race into what we're doing in our work, in our workplace. And for me, that's where we begin with assessment. We start with knowing who we are and what's important to us. And I think for assessment, when we're really wanting to show what we know, we have to become who we are to do that. So for me, assessment is self-understanding, knowing who you are, how you fit into the world, and how you can contribute to humanity. It's also about connection. It's how do you connect to yourself, the people in your community around you, knowing your purpose for the world and what you're actually doing here. It's also around knowledge. What do you need to know to be your own person, to be the very best person you can be, and what you can contribute with your own unique skills. And then it's around the competencies. What are the competencies that you need to learn and return to this world and to this earth? And I think for a long time, we've been thinking about assessment as very binary, or just about one area that we need to prove that we know something in one way. And so for me, it's been really exciting to start to hear the conversations lifting up and moving on and saying, actually, no, there's more to this assessment piece than we've been thinking. Really, if students can show what they know in their way, then we're really hearing who they are. Then we're really giving them an opportunity to show what they know in their way. So for me, it's really about redefining what does success look like. And each culture, each community can do that. And I think when we did the project of New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, we looked at providing a description across learning progressions for what does creativity look like? What does competencies in different areas look like? And to be honest, I thought there was no way that would work, because how could we define it for anybody? But what I learned from that was that when people brought their own evidence to this, brought their own indicators to this, and said, this is what it looks like for us, and had that deep discussion around that, then I started to see something different emerge. I started to see a new way of thinking emerge. I started to see people understanding themselves a little bit better. And then I started to understand that when people know who they are and they can find their own evidence to prove something in their own way, then something really started to shift inside a whole system. So for me, it's if we can lift up and describe something at a different level than what we have been doing so in the past by saying it has to look like this, then we started to see a real shift in society and a shift in the way we were thinking about things. And we can do that in a whole lot of different ways. So once we can say, you show me what you know in your way, does it match what I know or what I think about it in my way? And if we can find a common ground on that, then I think we're starting to see maybe we can get a chance of equity. That it doesn't have to look like what I believe it to look like, but it can still look like what still has the same meaning, but we're showing it in different ways. So when we're talking about a cultural difference, when we're talking about equity, we have to redefine success. because meaning and fulfillment is the new wealth, and contribution is the only way to earn it. And the way we can do that is by letting each other show what we know in our own way. So I think we can do that as a system if we describe together what success looks like in our own community, in our own school, in our own country, and then we can do that globally.
Are you seeing countries which are leaning in to that philosophy and beginning to embrace that system-wide, or do you think that's an idea which is still growing and in its infancy?
It's still growing in its infancy. What I have seen is that there are certain cohorts in certain states and certain areas that are starting to do that. I know a lot of Indigenous communities are doing that anyway, and that's really where we're starting to see a whole lot of the sort of traditional knowledge coming to the fore. And I think if we really listen to that, then we're starting to see a huge change, because they've always had this understanding that it's not necessarily about the individual, it's about the collective, about the way that we work together and the way that we can describe something together. So I sort of talk about assessment as not necessarily going to be individual for forever. We've just made it that way because that's the westernized view of thinking. If we can start to see if we can contribute in a collective form, is that not enough? I think when we start to break it down and say we individually have to be this, 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 and this, that's a very different view from, okay, can we collectively look after something? Can we collectively create something together? And you think once we get into the workforce, we're not really judged individually. We're actually, can this whole team of people create something? Can this whole group of people create something? So for a long time, we've got really stuck in the idea that it's only one individual who has to pass this test. But actually, when you get out into the real world, that's not the way it is. So we do have groups of people in different countries who have really embraced this ideal. And we're starting to see once they do that, then every child seems to lift up and they start to feel that success. They start to understand that they are part of a bigger whole, which enables everybody to feel successful, which then starts to lift the level of ability and understanding across a team of people.
It's the social in assessing social and emotional learning, isn't it?
It is.
If we're talking about collaboration or whatever it might be, I can't be the only good collaborator in my class. There have to be
exactly
to collaborate with. And yeah. Jacob, a lot of your work at the Centre for Hybrid Intelligence is also looking at gamification, isn't it? And the use of games to help with assessment. And so, you know, could we bring you into the conversation again at this point and thinking about what Jojo was just saying? How do you see games fitting into this new assessment worldview?
So, yeah, I completely agree. And I think that one of the big challenges is to formulate assessment in a completely new way. In the cell context, we have to think about assessment not as these sort of individual charts where you know whether you're in the top 80% or 90% or something, right? Because what we have to tell through the assessment is a narrative of the many paths to success. And that's exactly what we just heard about. And I think this is where the digital interactions, the games, and also from our point of view, the link to modern research and saying we actually don't know what good collaboration is, and sort of linking in and saying, well, we are all in it, trying to understand this thing that none of us actually sort of grasp completely, but we see different kinds of sort of aspects that we know are important. So we know that it's important to have trust, and we know that it's important to collaborate, and that there are different aspects of that. And I think in a game sort of like or a dashboard wise, like it's very much sort of facilitating this, just like Lego is launching sort of a new game-based initiative to sort of for education, and it's all about sort of showing the multiple paths to success. And I think this is where games can really be very powerful for that.
Jen, I can see you nodding. Would you like to come in on this point as well?
Absolutely. So before joining WISE, I spent a number of years at a research group called the MIT Education Arcade, where we did a lot of work in game-based environments and assessments. And that was actually my entree into competencies a decade ago, because there's some really great researchers doing incredible work on building game-based environments that not only can capture better insights, to Jacob's point, you know, we're still figuring out what these things are, giving handles to these things. So these environments can become rich fields of data and insights into learning learners' interactions and experiences and the ways that they grow these broader competencies. But more importantly, I think they're also really powerful tools for helping learners cultivate these competencies and these important skills. You know, if you sit down and try and give a direct lesson about ethical thinking to someone, it might stick with them, but for the most part, that's not really how one gains ethical thinking. We need to have experiences and be immersed with others. To Jojo's point, you know, it's about the social interaction of learning, the collaborative nature of those interactions, that together we make meaning and grow our own individual skills, but we do it in relationship with one another. And so game-based environments can be really powerful tools for helping to cultivate with learners, particularly because these are also many skills that many teachers today don't have a depth of training in. I think we're seeing that increase, which is fantastic, but it's still, you know, pretty new. I know I started my career as a teacher. I was not trained in how to teach, by and large, any of these social and emotional skills. And so how do you begin to teach a child about ethical thinking? You know, and so these game environments can give very helpful handholds, and I would say guides to the teacher to create sort of a bone to tussle over that would otherwise not be necessarily built or available for them to build lessons around. So they're wonderful tools.
And I think just to add to what you're saying, Jennifer, it's like whenever I do any work now, I always create a learning progression for adults first, so that they can actually understand and see, where are you sitting on this before I even begin to work with kids? Because I think what I learned is that as adults, we've forgotten who we are. We forgot where we came from, and we forgot to know about what matters to us too. So when I started doing some of this work, I realized that teachers would crumble in front of me because they had really forgotten to understand about what's important to them. So what I've got is a set of learning progressions that are actually designed for adults first, and then there's a set for children too, because it's really important to go back and remember remember what's important to me, and then figure out what is the evidence that I need to actually show that I'm doing okay for myself first. And I talk about a dissonance that sits inside teachers at the moment, that they're doing things that they know is inherently wrong for kids. And it's not that they're burnt out, it's that they're suffering from this dissonance. And it's because they really want to do the right thing, but they're being asked to do things that they know is not correct anymore. And they're seeing that inside themselves, and they still have to pay their mortgage. So they know that they want to do something quite different, but they don't know how to get out of that. So it's about giving them that confidence to know that they can move into a different pathway. They can do things that are actually going to really help their learners, to assess them in the way that's really going to give them that boost to know what to do. So it's about giving them ideas to create, firstly for themselves, secondly for the families around them, so that they can become that community again of learning together. And then there are tools for the kids as well. And I think it's always, if we're thinking about it as a whole community, and we do have knowledge in our communities, we do have people who understand this work. And if we just stick with the teachers only, we're missing out on a whole enormous workforce of people who understand about life and love and really understanding what counts for humanity. And that's where assessment comes in. It's like, how do we know what we all want to do and be if we don't bring in the whole community to this whole problem together?
Yeah, and I think also, so one thing that I wanted to also comment on the playfulness was that the playfulness is sort of the absence of goal orientation, and so that is a mode of when Jojo is saying that. So it's also saying that we need to find ways of changing our mindset, of moving outside of that mindset, and playfulness is one thing, and the other thing is what I talked about earlier is just sort of digital interactions in total is not sort of the end all be all, and it's just what we need to do, but it's just that it allows us to experiment with this scaffolding. How is it that we initiate conversations where we are not necessarily in all classrooms, or when all successful teachers are not necessarily able to go to all other classrooms? And so that's the part of the scale up that is very important, is that we can learn from each other's experiences. And maybe, as I said a little bit earlier, maybe that experience goes through a digital interface and then it goes back into sort of an analog classical classroom.
It's removing a lot of the competition, isn't it, which is inherent in so many different kinds of education outcomes at the moment, and focusing more on this idea of collaboration or the collective learning opportunity. In 2020 has been more disruptive for education than probably any year globally that any of us have ever lived through before. And what you're saying about ways in which assessment is evolving, I think chimes with lots of new thinking about what do we value most in education, and what is being revealed about what we value most because of the pandemic and because of school shutdowns and things like that. So it would be great to get your reflections on how we can keep hold of some of the disruption and some of the positive revelations that have come from this year as we move forward, and that we don't revert back to just doing what we all did in education back in January of this year or in 2019. And Jen, maybe you could come in on that, because you're working, like I said, at the absolute cutting edge in lots of ways with the Innovation Hub.
Yeah, and so my hope is that this year has really pushed many schools who otherwise felt unable to innovate or take deep risk into the deep end of the pool. And I think for me, as someone who spent my whole career in this space, hoping to see deep change in schools, that's been the one silver lining to this pandemic. Certainly, it's been difficult on so many levels and presented a lot of challenges, but I think we've sort of been very hesitant to make deep changes in education. And so that's the one, I think, silver lining for me when I look at this work. And I hope that, to Jacob's point about also embracing that playfulness, in the schools that we work with, they've already sort of bought into taking the journey to deep change. But even on that work, we really encourage them to embrace that playfulness. So I ask schools now, any school that I may be talking to or supporting, to embrace that nature and to just see what works and what doesn't, what is helping you get to where you want to go to, and being okay with making some of those changes. I think, we've had to make those. And so the work that you're doing at Salzburg and at WISE, that Dr. Asma Spadala is leading, really important work. We're also disseminating those findings. So this is a leapfrog moment where we can make deep shifts. And so painting examples of those, showing what that can look like, and encouraging those kind of deep reorganizations of a school model is I think a really good first step in making sure we don't lose this moment.
Yeah, so if I can chime in a little bit, so I think also that one of the opportunities that we're seeing in the current crisis is that emotions are so sort of apparent to everyone. So that means that where the sort of positive and negative spillovers of personal reflections were not so clear. Now it's on a massive scale, right? And so there's initiatives going on to map what is student happiness in the various different classrooms and virtual classrooms. And I think we have an obligation as a community also around assessment to make sure that this is something that continues, that this focus on the emotional aspects of it is something that continues throughout this sort of crisis. So we've been experimenting in our center with sort of bringing the connection between the macroscopic world that's going on, so with the COVID crisis and everything, and maybe all of the political dilemmas of how do you respond to such a crisis, and then sort of introvertly also sort of saying it, if we have a discussion about that in a classroom, then that's an occasion, sort of maybe creating a psychologically safe space where the whole world is affected by this. So now it's also safer to start reflecting on how I am personally reflected by this or affected by this. And I think this is sort of a good opportunity of us to learn sort of how to bridge the gap between the outside world or the sort of materialistic world and what's happening, what do we need to learn, what's going on, and then what's going on inside of us. And I think this has been so immensely powerful in the stories that we hear throughout sort of the educational and also sort of throughout the society, that this is something that this is energy that we just need to keep building on.
And I think just to add to both of what these wonderful people are saying is that I have a saying that no one is coming, and this has been more evident now than ever before, that, there isn't anyone coming to rescue us from this, that we are the people, we are the system. So each community is their own system. And I think the system resides within each one of us. And we are the people who are the only people who are going to help get through this. And each group has an opportunity to create a new success story. And with all of our minds together, with all of our collective cognition, with all of our collective consciousness, we can recreate what the success story is going to be. And assessment is the first piece of that. It's like, where are we currently at? What do we know about ourselves now? What do we know about what we want? And what does success look like for us? And I think when we're talking about SEL and social justice, this is the time when we can say, who are we and what do we need for our children and what does it look like for us right now? And how do we recreate that within the structures of systems and policies, within the structures of what we want to behave like and what do we really believe? And I think this has given us a really big opportunity to do that. And the first part is to know who we are, as I say, and that's only through assessment we can do that, because that's really taking stock of what we've got going on right now. And there's never been a time in my lifetime, and I'm getting old now, that we can actually know that for sure about what's happening. So this is the time for every single person to stand tall, or to tangata, I say, and actually really be strong about this and really take a chance and take an opportunity to really say, we are the system, we can make this change, and we've got this opportunity to do it now, and to really stick to what we can try and make a difference for the kids in our lives. Because what we had before was not working for every child. It was working for some groups of kids, but not for every child. So this is our opportunity.
I just wanted to add on to that and underscore everything that Jojo said. I think it's spot on and well stated. And I just want to underscore, especially though, the way that you framed the questions that you're asking, knowing where we are and where do we want to go. And I think that's framing that is really important for a number of reasons, but one of which, because for a broader audience, when we use words like assessment, it so often locks us into a mindset of what that needs to look like and what that is and needs to be. And so it's really interesting and very joyous to me that a number of the schools I work with actively will not use that word. And they do it purposefully because they're trying to break out of that box. They're trying to break out of the, rigidity that we have come from to leap to a new future and to be the one saving ourselves. And so I don't have such aversion to the word, but I understand why, I think the framing of those questions that way is really important.
What are the alternative phrases that the schools you work with use?
They talk about, the one school, Academiati, is one of the most progressive schools in Doha, and it really, they just talk about the ways in which they document learning. So they use floor books and learning journeys to document learning, but they never use the A word.
Right.
So I think also that one of the key questions to what Jojo said about discovering who we are, as I said before, is sort of discovering how it's okay to be different, and that diversity is okay. And so one of the ways in which we're sort of trying to sort of at least tap a little bit into that is that we're working with this game-based assessment, and with this game-based assessment for cognitive mapping or for creativity, the importance is really to sort of showing how, if you have a scoreboard, which is so you're so good in working memory and you're so good with all kinds of other skills, then it lies on us to start developing these narratives of what is it that successful learners have been doing with what they have. And so I just think that it's so powerful. One of the stories that, so like working memory is such an important thing for learning, but knowing that you are sort of low on working memory can be such a superpower, because it just means that you sort of have to shift strategy, and you just have to know about these strategies. And so one sort of very powerful example I heard about that was that there was a mathematician who was just, so he had the worst working memory of everyone, and he always failed in the classrooms of mathematics because he never could sort of remember anything. But he became a brilliant mathematician because he taught himself to rederive all of those equations, to think mathematics. And so that means that what seemed maybe from the onset to be his weak points became his strengths by working sort of on that. And I think it's on all of us to develop these narratives of success stories, not successful athletes or superstars, but how we sort of have been able to, ordinary people and many people sort of in various different settings have been able to work with themselves and who they are by knowing themselves, sort of metacognitive reflection, and drive that to have those strategies. Because I think it's very, very difficult for learners themselves to be processing what does it mean to be what I am. Even if we give them an assessment on that, we have to also sort of help them on that path to working with that knowledge and what to do with that knowledge. And I think that's a huge responsibility that sort of lies on us to develop that pathway.
I think that speaks really beautifully to the very heart of what we were interested in exploring with this whole topic of social emotional learning and social justice. That if social and emotional learning is about educating the whole child, and a key component of social justice education is about educating all children, how do you bring those two things together? And a lot of this new thinking around social and emotional learning lets children show the things that they're good at, but recognizing that they develop at different speeds and different paces, and that it needs to be, you need to come into it with an abundance mindset, that it isn't being done at the expense of recognizing cognitive achievement or academic skills. You can do this in addition to all of that because they reinforce one another.
I talk about that, Dominic, as having circles of success. And I developed a theory called authentic mixed method assessment, where we have multiple circles of success for everybody. And so you might have a circle of success that might be your academic results. You might have a circle of success around your social and emotional learning results. You might have a circle of success about your family. You might have a circle of success around your sports. You might have a circle of success, whatever you decide that they are. And then for me, it's about how you synthesize all that together to know who you are as a whole person. And often we have those circles of success stay very separate, and we don't pull them together, and one gets much more weight than the other. So what I sort of talk a lot about, how do we actually make sure that everybody knows they each carry a huge amount of weight for all of us, and that when we synthesize that all together, that makes us that whole person. So one piece of that, one of those circles is not who we are. So if that one of those falls down, we've still got all the rest of us that we're holding that strong and true to us. So for me, it's really critical that we teach children that we are more than the sum of one of those things. We are the sum of all of those things, all of our circles of success. So if we can help each child recognize that we are each, we're juggling these balls or these circles of success quite a lot in our lifetimes. But often I see, a lot of suicide rates, a lot of children feeling bad about who they are, because just that one circle of success usually is the academic one that we put so much weight on. But actually, if we can teach our children that there's so many of those other circles that sit around them, and that's just one piece. So if we can lift it up and have all of those kids understanding that they're multiple pieces of, or in language languages kids, and they seem to understand as the circles. And then we bring them all together, and then we're one big person. And I think when we can do that, that just seems to simplify it down to a really simple language. And it means that we can rely on a whole lot of other places and a whole lot of other circles around us that can give us that identity about who we are, and we can stand tall or two tangata in that. And that when one falls down, we can use some of the other pieces of us to help us to build that back up again. Otherwise, I see a lot of systems, their academic results going up like that, but also their suicide rates and their mental health going up, and they meet in the middle. So it's like, how do we make sure through our assessments that we're actually learning about who we are in those multiple areas, so we don't have that peak of academic and suicide rates meeting in the middle?
I really like that framing. And I think one of the questions that I sit with in this whole space is what happens when those circles are concentric too. And so what happens when the SEL work is at the core and it's the foundation, because we are whole people that come to school to learn and grow and develop. And we treat the academics, to your point, very often as the primary gold ring that we're seeking, when in fact, as the late Ken Robinson used to say, that's just, we're worried about to the brain and to the left, and that's, we're so much more than that. And so what happens when we focus primarily first on the whole child, and then them supporting them and developing these different circles. And at the school that I mentioned, Academieti, their model is set up in that way, where well-being is one of the primary drivers of the school and one of the primary elements that they cultivate and support over the year, particularly with their staff. So they have a staff member whose primary job is the director of well-being, and that's all that she's looking at. And in some of the schools that I've worked with over the last few years, part of this whole transforming the model, what can they become, what should they become, does require rethinking a lot of the measures we use to manage systems of learning, these complex systems that are education systems. And one of those things we were looking at is the well-being outcomes of an environment. How can you go into a learning environment and know that it's an environment that supports well-being, and use that as an indicator of a quality school rather than test scores on traditional discipline and academics?
Could we stick with that example, Jen, and get a bit more granular, and I think start to address the question that Cecilia has just posed in the chat as well, of sort of looking for concrete or real examples that you've all seen in practice of how schools are actually embedding this, because it's much easier to talk about the ideal or what we would like to see schools doing than it is to actually implement it. So just was it Academia, the school you mentioned?
Academieti, yes. So they're a younger age school. Learners are 4 to 7 at the moment, and they will scale as the school gets older. But I think it's one of the primary research questions that we're looking at as we support their journey through time, and looking at the impact that has on so many other dimensions that we care about. They're one of the schools that has the benefit of being able to redesign their model from the ground up, and we know there's a lot of benefit when a school can do that. But not all schools have to do that or can do that. And so I think with with the SEL work, you know, I always come back to the questions we started with in this panel, which is like, what is the purpose of education? What is the outcomes that we're really seeking? And a question you asked not long ago, Dominic, about what has this pandemic introduced into our awareness about that question specifically? And I really hope that well-being has been one of those elements that has been put to the forefront for everyone. And seeing then how that does need to be something that parents are fighting for in their children's school, and worrying about where that sits in the curriculum and how it's supported. It typically doesn't do well when it is just an add-on, and you can carve out time in the class schedule where it is supported.
You go, Jacob.
No, I think just personally from our initiatives in schools, then when we see this, then it's immensely popular, and more schools want to sort of join in. And I sort of just want to say that I think that the coming battleground is going to be not at the school level, but sort of at a district or at the state level, where the battle that Jennifer is sort of saying will be relaxed, sort of if we are successful, and that is to sort of say that the whole learner is a prerequisite for the successful learner. And I think that sort of is starting to seep in with schools and with individual sort of schoolmasters, and saying, okay, we want to prioritize this. Where the sort of real battleground comes in is national testing and sort of this more uniform approach to education. And I'm hoping that sort of, as Jennifer said, the pandemic is going to bring it to the agenda and keep pushing it. And I think that will be an interesting sort of battleground on the sort of political scale.
And I think for me, I've developed what's called the contribution curriculum, which schools are using, and it has kind of 3 phases where we're looking at what are the conditions for the system to be in. So what does the school create? What does the system around it create? And we actually measure that to help them to see what the adults are doing to ensure that they're creating the right place for kids to be. And we look at the design tools. What are the design, because we have to shift what we're designing for children to be actually be a part of that. And what are the tools that are required for that? And we also measure, is that actually working or not too? And we're looking at the outcomes for teachers as well. And then we also have the outcomes, which I mentioned earlier, which is the self-understanding, the connection, the knowledge, and the competencies. And those are available for students to work through and teachers to teach through, and that they're actually able to be measured as well through learning progressions. And so we look at a whole system approach to actually shift the whole system towards looking at social and emotional learning as outcomes, but also using the academics as the content, because it's very hard to think deeply about nothing, and actually to use that sort of content as a medium, but also contextually based depending on the cultural identity of the students that we're working with. But it all has to be looked at from each of those different sections. And I think that unless we take into account the whole system as well, just as much as we look at the whole child and the whole teacher, everybody has to have a place that they feel is theirs and can contribute as part of that. And that's the outcomes are for contribution to be able to contribute to the world to make it a healthier place. And we've been doing that across different countries.
To think deeply about nothing is a quote that will follow you for months to come, I think. And I think I
Can I just say something that I think one of the main benefits of us starting with assessments or looking at assessments for SEL is that it becomes a knowledge sharing mechanism. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest challenges, is that especially within the SEL area, that there's so many sort of initiatives around the world, and knowledge sharing among them is very difficult. And so if we start to have an agenda of assessment, then we also will have sort of a facilitated pathway towards knowledge sharing on a global scale. And I think that's what we're doing also in sort of the Karanga, to try to put everyone together and around the same table and starting discussing. But assessment can really be the way in which we speak the same language.
One of the challenges that SEL has faced pre-pandemic certainly is that, that the context in which SEL is delivered, within which social and emotional learning is delivered, is so crucial to the success of the outcomes. And the intervention, which is designed for a group of high schools in Chicago, will not achieve the same outcomes if you roll out that intervention in Islamabad or wherever else in the world, because it was designed for a specific context. And that's been one of the barriers, I think, to knowledge sharing across systems. But Jen, I can see you nodding with this. Do you think that we're at a moment in time where there will be more cross-system sharing of approaches, and is the pandemic accelerating that?
So I hope that's the case. I get very concerned about the knowledge sharing, and I get very concerned about the other pieces to the ecosystem that influence K-12, particularly the assessment angle, and that is industry, higher education, and the alignment of those, or the lack thereof, that influences the innovation on the K-12 side. So, for example, in the US right now, there's a massive initiative taking place called T3, which is trying to move an entire architecture in place around skills and competencies so that people have better pathways to job placement and employers have better ways of identifying the right people for the job. That's all very good. A lot of that work, though, is building off of where we were. Where we were was not working very well. Standards-based education has a lot of limitations and challenges to it, a lot that rub actually with competency-based and with SEL work. And so I worry about, you know, how we're thinking about that whole pipeline. I just want to also, in response to this, and add to something Jacob said, I think assessment can be the piece, but I'll also say that the competency, the curriculum aspect, which I know Jojo's done a lot of work in, we're doing work with that through the Innovation Hub, which is creating these curriculum frameworks or competency frameworks for these SEL competencies and other competencies, but creating a collaborative, a way to make those accessible. They can and should be the spine of any good assessment, and they should be related. And this was a lot of the work I was doing at MIT, was looking at this disconnect where we build these great assessment models that folks like ETS do as well. When they build an assessment, they do all this deep dive into what is creativity, what is collaboration, and then none of that model gets shared with people building curriculum or doing other assessment work in schools. They should all be shared and they all should be aligned. And so that's a lot of my fear, is that we're not doing that. So I hope that the work that we're seeing right now is setting the foundation for us to move in that direction.
And I think to add to that, Jennifer, what I do is that the tools that we use to assess are the same tools that we use to design with. And it's a prerequisite for anyone that we work with, that they must use the same set of tools for both, because otherwise you can't be, it's unfair otherwise. And the other thing is that knowledge belongs to all of humanity. And I think we've got to get over this. The issue is that education is expensive. Education people are making money from. And I think once we can get to the point of recognizing that meaning and fulfillment is the outcome of education in life, we've got to get past how do we get through that? That's the bigger question around assessment, because there's a lot of companies making a lot of money out of this. And then I put that out on the table and just say that's really what's stopping it. And it's one of the biggest issues around it. So I mean, for me, it's you know, I sell myself short all the time because I want to give it away. Because I think that it's really about how do we help people and humanity. And if we can get to the point where it's not about money, then I think we'll be able to get a lot further, a lot faster.
And I just wanted to follow up also on Jennifer's concerns. And I had some discussions with the US Labor Department, and with respect to sort of this new framework for skills assessment and sort of job placement, they thought that everything was solved, and they had a fantastic roadmap and they just wanted to solve it. And they were shocked when I told them that we actually don't know what creativity is. No one can actually measure it. And suddenly the whole thing sort of crumbles together. And I think that's the battleground. That's the responsibility that we have to take on, is to sort of cry wolf and say, we actually don't know the answers yet. And we are not ready for a framework of rolling out. There's lots of things that we still need to know. And until we do, we need a very inclusive process, and not one in which we say, okay, there's a company that knows what creativity is, so let's just give them some money and then job placement will be solved in the future. And I think that's one of the challenges of communication that we have ahead of us.
So that creates an interesting tension for this moment in time, though, doesn't it? Because there's certainly from at the policymaker level and at the parent and at the school level, there's more appetite for reform at the moment because of what we've learned during the last 6 months. And so, you know, are we ready to move forward with that reform? Because the window of opportunity for driving through some of these changes is going to close, you know, as more and more societies come out of the pandemic, and there's the economic pressure to revert back to how things were, you know, pre-pandemic. How quickly do you think reform-minded systems can move at the moment? There's a small question for all three of you as we get to the edge of time.
if I can say personally, I don't think that there's a small window of opportunity right now. I think that there is this huge discussion about skills and skills of the future. And that's not something that is just sort of specific to the pandemic. That's not something that's going away now. It may be amplified. It may give us a new context to discuss this, but I think that's an agenda that is here to stay. And I just think we have to be in it for the long haul and taking that discussion.
I think it's really an exciting time. And if we've got the courage, and I say that word really strongly, if we have the courage to actually take this moment in time and do the right thing for humanity and for the planet, then we can do it. I think it's if we get frightened and if we think that we can't do it, and if there's any fear and awe, then we won't do it. And it's easy to slide back because it's easy to go back to what we know. But I think we have to have courage and we have to hold each other accountable. I think that's the biggest thing. If we can hold each other accountable, especially groups like ours that are doing this for the right reasons, then I think we can get there. But I think it's a moment in time that we cannot afford to lose, but we have to show huge courage for the sake of humanity.
I'll just say that I agree with both statements, and I especially agree that I don't think we're turning back. I think there will be, 2 steps forward, 1 step back in some ways as education systems find their pathway to the future. But I think this conversation and movement towards competencies and skills has already begun, and the movements we're seeing will only continue. My hope is that, we can at least begin to put some tools into the parents and children's hands, particularly around SEL, because I think if you start to give them some structure and tools that can live outside the school more easily and in their hands and empower them on their journey, it becomes a leverage point for us to also continue that change inside schools and education systems.
So more direct tools for parents and students to be able to use to track their own progress with social and emotional learning. Are there other, as we get to, it's going to be the last question before we close out, but are there other sort of concrete, immediate next steps that the 3 of you think are going to be really useful for helping these reforms to stick and for us to build on them as we look at sort of different education paradigms in the future?
One thing I would always say is that leaders who are doing this work is that they get personally engaged, and it's not a sign-off thing. They don't just sign off and say, and pass the buck to the people who are doing the work. I think that if everybody brings their whole self to this work, that's when we start to see the really big shifts occur, because this is now personal to the world. It's not just something that we can do lightly. It's actually, when I see really big shifts happen in any system that I'm working with, is when the leader themselves actually engages in this work and really understands it, because that's when we see momentum starting to happen and really take off. So personal engagement from everybody involved is really critical, because they then understand the shift themselves. It moves from just the collective cognition to the collective consciousness.
Great, thank you. Jacob, any final words from you before we close out?
No, I just think that we have to sort of appreciate the power of assembling everyone, all the voices in a sort of a single forum. And I think that's why the work with the Karanga and just sort of unifying the discussion and putting it in one place and that also making it easier to sort of reach stakeholders, all stakeholders at the policy level is going to be important. So speaking with not one voice, but a cacophony of voices that are sort of at the same tune is very important for the future.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think when we started Karanga grew out of work that we'd been doing in Salzburg. And Salzburg, when we first started to look at social and emotional learning, we kind of heard all sorts of different advocacy arguments as to why it was such an important reform agenda. But what we heard really consistently was that there were 3, I suppose, supply side blockages. So there were challenges in every system around teacher preparation, adult understanding of the topic, because it wasn't a component of teacher training. There were challenges around curriculum design, and there were challenges around measurement and assessment. And I think what Karanga is trying to do and is beginning to move forward with is how do you bring those 3, the solutions to those 3 blocks under one roof and think collectively about the whole ecosystem and moving SEL forward within that. Thank you all so much for being part of this and for your time. Thank you also to the previous panelists. All of the recordings from today, from these 2 discussions and from the 2 earlier in the day, will be on Salzburg's website within the next couple of days. We'll also be sharing an insights for practitioners output from this by the end of the week, I hope, or the beginning of next week, with some summary points from each of the 4 discussions for everyone who'd registered to attend. I'd like to thank our 3 core Education for Tomorrow as well partners, Microsoft, ETS, and QFI. And as Claire, I think it was mentioned at the beginning of this, that this session today has been part of a wider program of SEL activity that Karanga is helping to organize across this week. There's more information about all of the activities on Karanga's website. Tomorrow, there's going to be a really interesting discussion about education in emergencies as part of the partnership that Karanga Salzburg and Salzburg have with Knowledge Hook. We're all in an education emergency in many different ways at the moment, so it should be a really interesting conversation. On Friday, there is also a session as part of the C20, Civil Society 20 Global Summit, looking at SEL and grand international challenges. There's also an awful lot of activity happening in one of our partner organizations, the SEL in Edu Facebook group, which is an amazing community, which was set up at around the same time as Karanga with more than 7,000 members now. So if you're on Facebook, I would encourage you to join that. So once again, thank you very much to everyone who's joined this and to all of the speakers across the day. It's been fantastic learning and listening with you. And thank you all very much.